what is the value of open access to data catalog? So part of this is like, I'm not stating what is the value of a data catalog. I'm really kind of promoting in a broader scheme a data catalog that is open to as many people within your organization as possible, right? And the reality is that this technical metadata, it's critical information for any data-related project. It's not just needed by your database administrators or developers. Like report developers have enormous value that they get out of having access to the catalog, the technical metadata information. Data analysts get a lot of value out of that. Your standard sort of users or layperson who might be doing self-service reporting. Even beyond that, you might have some people who have a certain level of interest in that. So having access to the technical metadata becomes really, really important by more people than just your technical, core technical people who typically have access to it now. And one issue is that lack of access to that knowledge of within the data catalog creates bottlenecks. So oftentimes you end up having to funnel questions around, where does this exist in the tables or whatever, to either, very busy or high cost kind of technical resources. That's not a very efficient technique. Or even more importantly, like it can prevent your staff from even knowing what is possible. Like without having sort of access to this, they might not even know to ask for information or ask for access to data or ask for a report because they don't know what exists in these data systems or in the data systems at all. So it's really important to not only talk about creating this data catalog, which many of you can kind of figure out why that'd be important to your developer, but think about extending this catalog to a much broader set of users. So part of this is that you want to avoid sort of conflating security concerns here, that access to the metadata has often been paired with access to the data. So I know some of you are probably beyond this with certain tools, but if historically, if you're working with a SQL database or something like that, in order to figure out what's going on in all the tables, you sort of need to have access to an administrative tool that often pairs access with the actual ability to query the data. So most of the time when people are concerned about access to a system, the vast majority of that concern is around getting access to data they shouldn't see. And so it's important to kind of note that it's okay to broaden the access, and having someone outside of who may not technically yet or at all be allowed to see the data, it's okay to them to know about the existence of the data because they may be able to request a report or to know about it, or it may be important to them, or they may be able to make their case for why they need that data. But if they don't have access, if they don't know that it exists or be able to look at that metadata, that's a problem. So the important thing about this catalog is to sever the ties between those two things. So there's real value in severing the access to the data from the metadata. So some organizations choose to limit data access sort of by hiding its existence, and this is, I would recommend this not be a good practice. So, if you can figure out how to liberate the metadata and let people know about it, and then control access. So people are out there figuring out, hey, there's some data here that I want to get to. So, control access by allowing people to have open access to the metadata, then offer an entry point to request access to the known data. Don't just hide it from their existence, because ultimately what we're trying to do here, and we've sort of skipped over a lot of this background, is to create a data-driven culture within your organization. And if you're not helping to facilitate the use of data, you're standing in the way of that goal. But we understand real security concerns around the data. So severing the relationship and access to the metadata from the access to the data by tool and by policy is incredibly helpful. All right, so one of the reasons that this is a problem right now is that there's this current sort of data knowledge, chasm. So how do most people access metadata in your organization? How do they try to bridge this chasm? Unfortunately, what that usually includes is having to have access to one of these like developer tools. Now this isn't always the case, but maybe it's PL SQL Developer or SQL Server Management Studio or Toad. These are the things that really combine these administrative DBA tasks as well as metadata discovery, as well as query access. And this is what I'm trying to say. You want to sever that as your primary. These are powerful tools for a developer, but not the thing that you want necessarily a report writer or a lay person who's trying to do self-service reporting and having access to. So in order to get access to this, typically, first of all, they have to know the data system exists. Now, hopefully you're solving that with an inventory feature that says like, hey, we have a data system that's storing customer retention data, right? That's helpful. Two, then they have to know who to ask to get access, right? If you're lucky, there's like online documentation available. Like, maybe there's something provided by these vendors that don't, where they are publishing metadata, or there's other ways that you're generating metadata. We'll talk about that in a minute for online access. But if not, then what they need to do is like get permission to access the system. So if they do have to get through, using one of those PL SQL tools or whatever, then they have to get permission to access the system. But wait, now they find out that's behind the firewall. So the next thing they have to do is like get a login and install some VPN or remote desktop on their machine, right? And then once they do that, they need to determine which metadata tool they need for access. So maybe they're going to get like Toad or SQL Developer or SQL Server Management Studio or some other tool that they can install locally and hook up to this system, and then they get that installed and configured, and then they realize it gives them access to more than just the metadata. So, and then once they finally get into it and they start poking around, they realize this is great. I can see all the tables and everything here, but I don't understand what this, ABC XYZ table is. What is this? Oftentimes they find that there's missing context, is what we're talking about, like supplemental information or curated information that's not always there in the documentation. So this is like the current data knowledge chasm that ends up with this combined, access to data and metadata and requiring the tools. And I'm a technical person, but still, like, if I hit this step 3 where I gotta install a VPN or something, I'm not going to go through that. I got enough stuff running on my PC. I would much rather have a way to install it to access this stuff directly. So I don't know how many of you have this type of barrier, but understand that one of the things that I've discovered over time is that there are technical people, there are developers and DBAs and everything who are so confident in their own skills, and they've been doing this so long, they don't understand how difficult this is for the average person to go through these hoops, right? And so like, oh yeah, it's not so hard. They just have to ask and they can do all these things, but it really, this is just an insurmountable barrier for many people to get access to.